Hi, and welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. My name is Stephen Parker, and I will be your guest host for today. I'm a longtime advisor for Grid Forward. I advise them on cybersecurity issues. In another life, I run an organization known as EnergySec, which is an industry nonprofit focused on cybersecurity issues in the electric sector. Today, I would like to welcome our guest for this session, Jim Schultz of Black & Veatch. Jim, pleasure to have you on the podcast today talking about cybersecurity. I want to give you an opportunity to provide people with a bit of your background and talk about what you've been doing during your career and what you're currently keeping busy with over at Black & Veatch.
All right, good. Well, thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am a cybersecurity lead for the Global Industrial Cybersecurity Group at Black & Veatch. I have over 30 years of experience in the water sector. I started out as a control systems engineer designing SCADA systems and moved more and more in the direction of IT, mainly in the form of IT-OT convergence and sharing that SCADA data with enterprise applications. And a long time ago, I ran into the Purdue model and began developing a passion for OT networking and cybersecurity, and that's what I've been doing for quite a while now.
Excellent. I'm from the electric sector, and the water sector is also quite important, as I think people recognize. So today, we're going to talk about the assertion that security does not equal compliance. And I have to admit, I have some biases on this topic. I've been playing in the compliance space for quite some time, but we're going to defer to your expertise and opinions for the most part. I will probably throw in some perspectives along the way. But to begin with, could you provide your perspective on what it means to be secure and how regulatory requirements relate to that in today's environment?
Sure. So I would start with saying that regulations are, of course, the top priority. Everyone needs to get that part right. If you don't, there's consequences for your organization and potentially you individually. So that's very important. However, I would say that regulations they typically cover the minimum requirements. So I think about the National Electric Code. You can always go up a size in wire in order to get less voltage drop across a wire, but you can't go lower. Okay, so there are a minimum set of requirements. There's all good reasons why those requirements are in there. Once you meet those requirements, I think you need to start to define what secure means. And the definition I've always used is that secure means reducing cybersecurity risk to a level that's acceptable to the organization. And maybe you've heard that too. So, if that's the definition, then I think the next big question is, do the regulations with these minimum requirements satisfy your organization's tolerance for risk? And if the organization wants to go further, that's great. I mean, it just makes, it just improves public welfare when, our electric systems are more secure and water systems. So if an organization wants to go further than that, then there needs to be a way to capture what that gap is. And what I typically recommend is that people stand up a cybersecurity governance committee dedicated to SCADA, write OT or SCADA cybersecurity policies, and develop high-level network drawings that at least illustrate the SCADA communication system. The SCADA to SCADA network communications and the SCADA to non-SCADA communications. I think those three documents really help to establish a vision, which is so important for cybersecurity, and it helps the organization to communicate with the employees what that extra level of effort in terms of cybersecurity is, so that they can achieve it.
And talking about compliance and regulations, what are some of the regulations that you're seeing that are relevant and industry that you've worked with?
Well, there's of course NERC-CIP. There is the TSA security directives for oil and gas. And there was something for water that came out last March 2023 and was later rescinded in October in 2023 for legal reasons. I guess certain folks took issue with the way the EPA went about putting out that mandate. So those are some of the regulations I've seen.
Yeah, you mentioned NERC-CIP. That happens to be an area in which I have quite a bit of experience in my career. I've been dealing with that for, more than 15 years now. There's a concept that SIP might make you more secure, or that being secure would get you to a point of SIP compliance. And I don't know that that's really reality, but could you go a little bit more on NERC-CIP as a security framework? And how does it compare to other frameworks that are in common use today?
Sure. So I've looked at NERC-CIP, ISA, IEC 62443, NIST SP 853, and a variety of other frameworks, just to understand what's out there and to understand what I could take from those frameworks and apply to the water sector, because there really isn't any, one document you can go to for the water sector. There's lots of small individual documents, and some are very good, like the AWWA guidance. But I've looked at all of them, and one thing I've noticed for sure is that they're all good, but they all have different strengths. And where one might be a little bit light on content, not on the requirements, but on the how-to, so to speak, you can go to another document and learn from that. So I think a really good example is NERC-CIP policies. So NERC does a really good job with NERC-CIP introducing policies right out of the gate, and they do a really good job capturing, what policies you should write. But they don't get into, a lot of detail on what the policies need to contain. So a good example is looking over at NIST 853 for what that policy content might be. And the reason I say that is that NIST 853 is written almost like policies already. So they have a lot of bracketed text that any organization can go in and replace that bracketed text with something that works for their organization. So for example, we will review account permissions and remove permissions 1 hour after an employee is no longer with the company. Okay, so that 1 hour is something that would be bracketed text that you would go and fill in with something that works for you. So that's just one example, and certainly the policies are going to talk about what you need to do, but not necessarily the how. If you take a look at IEC 62443, they've got a few documents that start to get into the how. So they have a very good document on risk management. They have another on patch management, and they really do a good job with a lot of supplemental guidance throughout all of those standards. So those are a couple examples. Another would be just incident response guidance. There just seems to be a plethora of different guidance documents out there that you can look to for inspiration on content.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of information out there, and you mentioned a lot of these frameworks don't get really specific. So you mentioned some implementation guides and things of that nature. In your experience, how are organizations dealing with that? The fact that you don't necessarily have a completely prescriptive check the box kind of thing. And I'll compare that a little bit to you mentioned the National Electrical Code, and that made me smile a bit. My father was an electrician for about 65 years, actually taught code classes, and the National Electrical Code is much more specific and prescriptive than we see in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity tends to be more objective based, and so how are organizations dealing with that and getting to where they know exactly what they want to do when the frameworks don't necessarily give them that information?
Well, that's interesting, because the TSA, when they came out with their initial security directive after the Colonial Pipeline, people felt it was very, very prescriptive. And 1 year later, on the anniversary of its release, they came out with a revision to it. And it was much more performance-based. So that was a little bit on cyber and being overly prescriptive in the way the general public responded to it. So, in terms of coming to terms with it, the way an organization would handle it, I think the best approach is after the regulations are met that you take a risk-based approach. Okay, and ideally it's going to reduce risk as much as possible, as quickly as possible, and hopefully for as little cost as possible. But that shouldn't be your primary consideration. And for that, we can turn to those other frameworks to inform the prioritization process. So, for example, 62443 has security levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. Security level 1 prevents against, accidents, harmless, non-nefarious acts. And security level 4, might be something to protect against a nation state, for example. So those different security levels help you to understand the priorities and what you should do first. The Center for Internet Security also has what they call implementation groups. And that's just another way to look at it and say, okay, what's the first thing we should do and the last thing we should do? And and even the cybersecurity framework has low, moderate, and high priorities. So in terms of, getting a grip on all the things that are out there and what to do first, those are some ways to look left and right at what's going on elsewhere to understand what the priorities are.
I think you might have stumbled across the key to why compliance is not equal to security. You mentioned in the TSA where they came out being very prescriptive, and I remember the hue and the cry from industry when that happened, and I think some of it might have had to do with the timelines were very short as well. And we've seen similar in the NERC-CIP world where there's this tension between some organizations want very prescriptive standards and others want the objective-based standards that provide them with flexibility. But if there's an objective and not a prescriptive approach, compliance can't really get you to security because you have to, again, as you've been talking about, look at the risk and decide, what is exactly right for your organization. So that can be, I think, a bit of a challenge. Along those lines, you mentioned a variety of frameworks, and most of the frameworks have very common themes. They tackle similar issues in similar ways, but they're all kind of unique in some way. NERC-CIP are, of course, mandatory requirements. Others, like you mentioned, 853 being a controls catalog, CSF being a framework. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between the different frameworks, and in particularly if you're trying to focus on compliance, keep your regulators happy, how can you reduce risk without necessarily doing everything that's listed in these frameworks?
Well, obviously, you can't prescribe an approach for all. I think that's what makes it so challenging. There's a lot of people who put a lot of effort into all the frameworks, and trying to have a crystal ball and predict everything that's going to come down the pipe is the biggest challenge. It's difficult to prescribe a solution for anybody tasked with that type of effort. I think the best way to manage the whole thing is to gather information such as like an asset inventory. Make sure your asset inventory can be depicted on, say, a layer 2 point-to-point wiring diagram that includes IP and serial. Develop a layer 3 network diagram, and then put together policies, just like the governance I was talking about before. And those policies would be customized to NIST 853. It's got 1,190 controls in it, so you have to go through and pick out what will work for you. And for the water sector, I've been through that and I identified about 300 that I thought were just highly relevant and would work really well. And that's the way it's intended to be used. They do have like low, moderate, and high baselines, but I've never found that cookie cutter prescribed approach to be relevant. And there's always some extra things you could do and some things that don't really work for you when you use those baselines. So that gives you a lot of granularity in terms of the controls that you might apply. And that approach also allows you to look at the architecture from the perspective of an attacker. If you have that good layer 3 diagram that shows your network to network connectivity, you can do what I call as a desktop penetration test, and you look at the system from the perspective of the way an adversary might, and look for additional vulnerabilities and ways that you can tighten things up that way.
So I'm hearing that there's no easy button. Just put, do this and push the easy button and make it all work. I want to dive into this, take a couple different angles. You'd mentioned levels of risk, or the implementation groups from the Center for Internet Security, 62443, having the different security levels. I think there's probably a couple different reasons for that. One is threats, right? Let's look at that one first. When you're assessing risk and looking at what you're trying to protect against, you had mentioned, earlier, protecting against the nuisance things, an error, human error, a mistake that might be made. And then on the other end of the spectrum, perhaps we're defending against the nation state type attacks. And the protections are going to be different based on the degree of threat. So where do you see people going and kind of trying to figure out what level of protection they're trying to get to, and where are people typically at on that topic?
Well, I would say it gets back to the organizational risk tolerance. You need to figure out what it is you're trying to accomplish. Otherwise, you'll never know when you get there. I say that all the time. You have to create that vision through policy, through architecture diagrams that explain what it is you're trying to do. And certainly, I always say start with a standard. Okay, don't try to invent anything yourself. Pick a standard. They usually have security levels or some other way of quantifying the amount of risk reduction that you're looking to accomplish. And you don't have to necessarily eat the elephant in one bite. So the cybersecurity framework has implementation tiers. And you can start off with where you are and then set the bar for where you're going to be next. And once you get there, you can raise the bar again. So, there's the ultimate of what you're trying to protect against. And I would hope that we're all trying to protect against nation state attacks. But there's the reality of where you are. And if you're going to write policies, that aren't achievable or sustainable, then you're going to fail. And organizations are faced with all kinds of constraints today. So you have, of course, funding, you have resources, you have expertise. So these are all challenges that need to be factored into where you are, where you want to be next, and your plan to get there. So that's a little bit about, how do you get to where you want to be? You have to define it. You got to come up with some sort of plan.
The flip side of that equation is from a risks or even a technology perspective. It can vary by organization. And I'll give you an example and let you kind of elaborate on it. The electric sector where I'm from, there's quite a bit of interconnectivity between organizations. The grid is interconnected. A lot of the control systems are interconnected. In the water sector, where you have your background, in many cases, that's not the case, correct? You have systems that are isolated. There isn't necessarily an interstate transmission system for water. So to what extent how would you look at an organization and look at the nature of what they are and what they do and the technology they have, and use that as a way to assess the risk and the protections that would be required?
That's really interesting because I think about that all the time. What's similar and what's different between the different sectors? So you're right, with the grid, we have a highly connected system. So you could have a blackout in the Northeast. It happened already. With water, you have systems that are typically connected, but the valves are closed to a neighboring water utility. So if you had to buy water because all of a sudden something wasn't working for you, you had that option. But the water systems are normally closed valves, between them. So there's a limit to, how far that can propagate. Plus the information systems are segmented and highly isolated. They don't talk to each other at all, or at least they shouldn't. So there's that, and I think of, in terms of other similarities and differences too, you have regulations which are different. Okay, you have consequences at the process level, so rolling blackouts, boil water alerts, explosions for electric, water, and gas. But I always say once you get above the pipes and the pumps, the technology and the cybersecurity all looks the same. All right. And that's where all these cyber controls are highly transferable. So you can be looking at NERC CIP 62443 and NIST 853 for inspiration. And the other good part of that is that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Eventually, you start seeing the same topics coming up again and again, and that's where you finally start to get your arms around cybersecurity.
It's interesting to see the differences at the operational level, but when you get into the technology, maybe the differences aren't so great.
Costly distribution upgrades, frequent extreme weather events, demand surging from an onslaught of distributed energy resources adoption. Do these challenges sound familiar? If so, you need Virtual Peaker's cloud-based distributed energy platform. We're empowering modern utilities with next-generation virtual power plant solutions to maximize the value of DERs. The Virtual Peaker platform unifies all aspects of DER management, from DERMS to customer engagement and demand forecasting. Learn more at virtual-peaker.com.
Kind of a related topic to that is, for years we talked about OT being different, operational technology being different versus the information technology. And those differences, I think, have been reducing. We're seeing more of the, IT type technology getting pulled into operational environments. And even though they might use perhaps different vendors, the underlying technology is the same, right? We have network switches, we have routers, we have firewalls, things of that nature. From a sector perspective, are you seeing differences at that level? I know a PLC is a PLC, but maybe it's implemented a little bit differently. What are some of the differences that might exist technologically, and similarities?
Well, whenever I talk to folks about IT and OT, we start with the priorities. So for IT, the priorities are confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and for OT, it's flipped around. Availability is the top priority, followed by integrity. And we really don't care all that much about confidentiality. If someone knows what the flow is through a pipe, probably nothing bad is going to happen as a result of that. But if someone prevents us from seeing what the flow is through a pipe, now we're flying blind and bad things can happen. If someone changes the value, the integrity is affected and makes us think that everything is okay when it's not, well, then bad things can happen that way too. So, in terms of technology, we're seeing more and more of a shift from on-prem isolated OT equipment to, more cloud-based. And, that raises all kinds of concerns in terms of who you're sharing resources with, your memory processing and storage. But we are seeing it happen. A lot of vendors are introducing that as an option. But, I think I just got off a call, frankly, today where there was this discussion about whether we're going to use SD-WAN and Cisco's software-defined access for IT and OT. And there was a lot of debate about, the importance of OT, the consequences at the process level, which is really about public welfare, employee safety, and that mission-critical business continuity of keeping the pipes wet, so to speak. And there was just a ton of discussion about how do you prioritize OT and what can you keep at the physically separate level on-prem versus what could be moved to a more virtualized environment. So, we're seeing a convergence, of course, in a slightly different sense. It's not just data now, but it's systems all working together.
You use the C word there, cloud, and I'm not going to pull that thread and go down that rabbit trail. That we might reserve as a topic for another podcast at some point down the road, because it's a huge topic right now across many sectors, because it's relatively new, not necessarily well understood, and there's a bit of a fear factor there. So interesting. Kind of bring it back to the regulatory side. And we've been talking a bit about differences between sectors and commonalities between sectors from a regulation perspective. And you had mentioned there was an attempt to regulate the water sector that has been beaten back, at least for the time being. But where do you think we're going from a regulatory perspective? And in particular, do you think we'll ever have a common regulatory framework across different sectors like water, electricity, gas, oil?
Oh, that's a dream of mine, just to have one set of rules everybody could follow. And, we are seeing like some convergence. All right. So I will say that when the TSA came out with that security directive after the Colonial Pipeline, they revised it to become more performance-based about a year later, as I said before. About a year after that, I forget the exact time frame, but they came out with almost the same exact requirements for rail. Okay, so now what do oil and gas and rail have to do with each other? And that just speaks to the transferability of the controls. And once you get above the pipes and the pumps, the technology and cyber look all the same. There is some speculation in the water sector that regulations could take the form of something like NERC-CIP. I tend to look at NERC-CIP and think, why don't we just use that? I mean, it's a very comprehensive set of controls that it's akin to 62443. Some, really bright people put a lot of thought into it. And I think, why not just start there, and you can develop it into whatever you want from that point, but it's a heck of a good starting point, and it sure beats starting with a blank piece of paper. So there's a couple of hints at some type of convergence, and then I guess it was last year, probably about last July, the White House came out with a request for feedback on opportunities and challenges on cybersecurity regulation harmonization. So people are talking about it, at least.
I believe DHS or CISA had put out I think they call them their performance objectives, which is somewhat of an attempt to harmonize across sectors. And then I think they turned around and said, now that we have this common set, you can customize them by sector, which is kind of an oxymoron. But have you seen those? Do you have any thoughts on that particular set?
Yeah. So what I think you're talking about is CISA's cross-sector cyber performance goals, CPGs.
Correct.
And the EPA actually took them and modified them for the water sector, and they apply to both water and wastewater systems. And, it's for the water sector, it's 33 controls. In terms of frameworks, it's probably the lowest bar to get over. Although when you start to unpack it, there's a lot in there that folks would need to do, and not easy stuff either. So it's a very good selection of 33 controls. So I have seen that. It's an interesting framework. I've actually done a couple assessments with it. It's a good entry level framework. I always use the analogy of the Home Depot paintbrush. Do you want good, better, or best? You got to say what you want from cybersecurity. And the CPGs and the Water Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, the WCAT, to me represents that entry-level paintbrush in terms of cybersecurity. So, hey, you got to start somewhere, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. I've bought some paintbrushes at Home Depot, and I don't remember which one we got. I think a lot of it depends on if it was a one-time job, you get the cheap paintbrush. If you're gonna be doing a lot, you maybe invest in a little bit more. So, interesting. On the baselines, I've heard that there's some standards that are being worked on for the electric distribution side, being worked on by NARUC. And from what I've heard, they're using the CISA performance goals for that. So it's interesting. Some of these are, and of course, those are not mandatory and they're not required, but they might become the basis for regulation. Where states could perhaps come in and say, hey, we want you to follow these and make it mandatory that they follow them. I know, just an example, I think you'd mentioned, wasn't the 62443, the API
1164, APA 1164?
That's the one. That was actually used by the state of Michigan in a regulation that they promulgated for their utilities in state, requiring them to follow API 1164, which was never intended to be a mandatory requirement. It was a framework put together, and now a regulatory agency has made that mandatory. So, we could perhaps see that happen, right? Instead of creating something new, they just take something that's out there, and maybe that's a risk with some of these frameworks that were intended to be guidelines. Certain
Right.
authorities making them mandatory, so that could be.
Yeah, sometimes you see wording like should, and it implies that the control is optional. And if someone is just looking to check the box and do the minimum, then they might not implement that. So sometimes the wording of the frameworks and the guidance documents that's out there doesn't necessarily lend itself to becoming a regulation.
Yeah, and that's a challenge when they try to shoehorn that into a regulatory thing. We've seen the government do it with FSMA, and of course they use NIST 853, but they don't require that entities perform all of those things. They say, hey, use this as a guideline, then you select the controls you think make sense. So,
right,
it's certainly interesting. So, getting finding this balance between security and compliance is challenging. And you've talked a lot about security and kind of approaching things from a security perspective. How do you map it? So if there's been a lot of talk, in my circles about, well, we don't want to do compliance. We want to do security, and we want our compliance to just happen out of that. So have you seen organizations that are focusing on security first, yet still able to meet the compliance obligations?
I think from what I'm seeing, people focus on the regulations, and that's the minimum. It's of course a defensible starting point. That's what I'm seeing. I can't say that there's any other order. I think they try for the regulations first. Once they're finished with that, there's of course some things that keep us all up at night. We want to prioritize those and get them off our plate. Certainly, looking at some of the priorities from the other frameworks can help in terms of taking it to the next level. And there's a lot of frameworks that'll provide that framework of establishing where you are, where you want to be, and developing a plan to get there. That's pretty much the basis of the whole NIST cybersecurity framework. So and that's what I'm seeing.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, talked about a lot of different things, and I think we're coming close to the end of our allotted time. So I want to give you kind of throw a question out there and let you respond and wrap up all your thoughts. One thing that I'm seeing, and I think you mentioned, the White House has put things out there and they have their cyber strategy and such. There's definitely a lot of pressure on critical infrastructure right now to strengthen cybersecurity. The federal government's pushing it hard. Likely, we're going to see more regulation coming down across various sectors, water, electricity, gas, oil, rail. You mentioned several of them. So just in summary, what final thoughts would you have for organizations that are looking at this and struggling? They have to meet both the external compliance requirements as well as their internal risk management priorities. What final thoughts do you have and recommendations for them to balance those two things and get to a state of happiness, I guess we'll call it?
Sure. So I think more regulation is inevitable. That's where we really see the most action. With NERC-CIP, see a lot of people, trying to comply with that. In other sectors, where it's not mandatory, there's less movement. There's competing needs for other operational funds. Okay, it's just that simple. It's not a lack of interest. It's just a lack of funding. So, for people who are struggling, I would say start with identifying the root cause of the struggle and identify ways to make that effort easier. So common obstacles that I see, things that are holding people back are budget, expertise, and resources. I mentioned those three before. And all of those can be addressed with additional management support. So certainly you have to have senior management support on cybersecurity because, trying to affect change by pushing up through the company just doesn't work. It has to be a top-down type of arrangement. And then in parallel with that, I would focus on the regulations first, then create that vision I was talking about, so that there's a clear vision of what the organization and each facility needs and wants to achieve in terms of policies and network architecture. So, I'd say, just to wrap it up, the vision is the essence of the leadership of any complex effort, like cybersecurity. So you got to create that vision.
All right, thank you. So our guest today has been Jim Schultz of Black & Veatch. Thank you for your time and your insights. I'm Steve Parker. I've been your guest host for today. I want to thank everyone for joining us and hope you'll continue to follow the Grid Forward podcast series for more insightful information. And perhaps we'll meet again, you and I, Jim, on another edition of this podcast, and maybe we can dive into cloud security as we discussed.
Well, that would be great. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks again to our seasoned sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Forward chats, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.